Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. The Watergate scandal stands as one of the most infamous political controversies in American history, a saga of power, deception, and presidential downfall. What began as a seemingly minor break-in at the Democratic National Committee, DNC headquarters on June 17, 1972, quickly spiraled into a full-blown constitutional crisis, exposing a deep web of corruption, illegal activities, and abuse of power within the highest levels of government. The break-in at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. was not a random crime. The 5 men arrested that night were linked to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign and were attempting to wiretap phones and steal documents from the DNC. Investigations soon revealed that the burglary was part of a broader pattern of political espionage conducted by Nixon's administration to undermine his opponents. In the months following the break-in, Nixon and his aides engaged in a massive cover-up, attempting to obstruct justice by bribing the burglars, pressuring investigators, and using federal agencies like the FBI and CIA to suppress evidence. However, 2 Washington Post reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, relentlessly pursued the story, uncovering deeper connections between the White House and the crime. Their reporting, with information from an anonymous source known as Deep Throat, later revealed to be FBI official Mark Felt, played a crucial role in bringing the scandal to light. As the scandal gained traction, Congress launched official investigations, and in early 1973, the Senate Watergate Committee began public hearings. The most damning evidence came when a former White House aide revealed that Nixon had a secret taping system in the Oval Office, which had recorded conversations proving his involvement in the cover-up. Despite his attempts to resist, Nixon was eventually forced to hand over the tapes, which included the infamous smoking gun tape, a conversation from June 23, 1972, where Nixon ordered his aides to obstruct the FBI's investigation. With undeniable proof of abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and criminal conspiracy, Nixon faced impeachment proceedings. Realizing he had lost all political support, he chose to resign on August 8, 1974, becoming the first and only U.S. president to resign from office. The following day, Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as president and later issued a controversial pardon for Nixon, sparking further debate over justice and accountability. The Watergate scandal permanently altered American politics, leading to new laws aimed at limiting executive power, increasing transparency, and strengthening campaign finance regulations. It also eroded public trust in the government, reinforcing skepticism toward political leaders and setting a precedent for investigative journalism's role in holding power accountable. Decades later, Watergate remains a defining moment in U.S. history, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and the resilience of democratic institutions. President Richard Nixon, once at the height of his political power after a landslide re-election victory in 1972, found himself at the center of a scandal that would destroy his presidency. As investigative journalists, the FBI and congressional committees dug deeper into the Watergate break-in, the truth became impossible to ignore. What initially seemed like an isolated burglary at the Democratic National Committee, DNC headquarters, turned out to be part of a larger pattern of political espionage, dirty tricks, and abuse of power. The unraveling of Nixon's administration was slow but relentless. As investigators pressed forward, they uncovered a series of secret White House recordings, missing evidence, and testimonies from former Nixon aides that exposed a coordinated effort to obstruct justice. The biggest revelation came when a former Nixon aide, Alexander Butterfield, testified that the president had secretly recorded all conversations in the Oval Office. These tapes held the potential to prove Nixon's involvement in the cover-up or exonerate him. Despite Nixon's repeated denials of wrongdoing, the pressure mounted as more damning evidence surfaced. When the Supreme Court ruled in 1974 that Nixon must release the tapes, the most incriminating piece of evidence, known as the smoking gun tape, was revealed. This recording from June 23, 1972, captured Nixon ordering top aides to interfere with the FBI's Watergate investigation, providing undeniable proof of his guilt. With impeachment looming and political support crumbling, Nixon made a historic decision. On August 8, 1974, he announced his resignation, becoming the first U.S. president to step down from office. The following day, Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as president, and in a highly controversial move, he later issued a full pardon to Nixon, preventing any criminal prosecution. The Watergate scandal was more than just a political crisis. It was a turning point in American history. It led to sweeping reforms, including stronger government oversight, campaign finance laws, and limits on executive power. Most significantly, it shattered public trust in government, reinforcing a deep-seated skepticism toward political leaders that persists today. Watergate remains a defining moment in U.S. politics, a reminder that no one, not even the president, is above the law. But was Nixon truly the mastermind of the cover-up, or was he merely caught in the crossfire of political warfare? To this day, debates continue about the extent of his guilt and whether the scandal was exaggerated for political gain. The Watergate scandal ultimately reshaped American politics, leading to Nixon's historic resignation on August 8, 1974, the only time a U.S. president has ever stepped down from office. How did a simple break-in escalate into a national crisis? What evidence sealed Nixon's fate? And could something like Watergate ever happen again? Let's unravel the full story. The 1970s was a decade marked by political turmoil, war, scandal, and a growing mistrust in the U.S. government. By the start of the decade, the Vietnam War had already dragged on for years, costing tens of thousands of American lives and fueling massive protests across the country. What had initially been framed as a necessary fight against communism had, by the late 1960s, become a divisive and deeply unpopular conflict. Many Americans began to question whether the war was worth the sacrifice, especially as casualty numbers rose. Government credibility crumbled, and media coverage exposed the brutal realities of combat. A turning point came in 1971, when Daniel Ellsberg, a former military analyst, leaked the Pentagon Papers, a classified government study revealing decades of deception about U.S. involvement in Vietnam. The documents exposed how multiple administrations had misled the public and Congress, overstating the likelihood of victory while secretly acknowledging that the war was unwinnable. When the New York Times and Washington Post published the papers, the government tried to suppress them, but the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the press, reinforcing the role of investigative journalism in holding leaders accountable. The Pentagon Papers deepened public distrust in the government, further fueling the growing anti-war movement and demands for greater transparency. As the war dragged on, President Richard Nixon sought a way to end it without appearing to surrender. His administration pursued a strategy known as Vietnamization, aiming to gradually withdraw American troops while increasing South Vietnam's role in the conflict. Despite peace talks, the war continued until 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords led to an official U.S. withdrawal. However, just 2 years later, Saigon fell to communist forces in April 1975, marking a humiliating end to U.S. involvement and solidifying Vietnam as a symbol of military and political failure. The aftermath of the Vietnam War left the U.S. grappling with its first major military defeat, a fractured society, and a crisis of confidence in its leaders. This disillusionment only deepened with the Watergate scandal, which further shattered faith in the presidency and exposed the extent of government corruption. The 1970s became an era of cynicism and skepticism, where Americans no longer blindly trusted their government's words and actions. The lessons of this turbulent decade continue to influence U.S. politics today, shaping debates on government accountability, military intervention, and the limits of presidential power. Amid the growing unrest of the late 1960s, Richard Nixon won the 1968 presidential election, presenting himself as the leader who could restore law and order and bring stability back to a country deeply divided by the Vietnam War, civil rights protests, and counterculture movements. Nixon's campaign successfully appealed to what he called the silent majority, the large, often overlooked group of Americans who were frustrated with the era's turbulence, opposed widespread protests, and sought a return to traditional values. Once in office, Nixon focused on ending U.S. involvement in Vietnam, implementing his policy of Vietnamization, which aimed to gradually withdraw American troops while increasing the South Vietnamese military's role in the war. At the same time, he expanded the conflict by secretly authorizing bombings in Cambodia and Laos, igniting further controversy and backlash. The revelation of these bombings, combined with ongoing anti-war protests, led to tragic incidents like the Kent State shootings in Saichi 1970, where National Guardsmen killed 4 student demonstrators. As Nixon prepared for re-election in 1972, he and his administration became increasingly obsessed with controlling the political narrative and eliminating any threats to their power. This paranoia led to the creation of a covert group known as the Plumbers, tasked with stopping government leaks and sabotaging political opponents. Their activities escalated into outright criminal actions, culminating in the infamous Watergate break-in, a botched attempt to wiretap the Democratic National Committee (DNC) headquarters. Initially, the burglary seemed like a minor incident, but investigative journalists, most notably Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, uncovered a much deeper conspiracy. As the Watergate scandal unraveled, it revealed a web of corruption, illegal surveillance, and abuse of power that led directly to Nixon's resignation in 1974. Though Nixon had won one of the largest electoral victories in U.S. history in 1972, his presidency would ultimately be defined not by his foreign policy or domestic programs, but by the scandal that destroyed public trust in government and reshaped American politics for decades to come. During the late 1960s and early 1970s, investigative journalism emerged as a powerful force in American politics, driven by the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, and growing government scandals. Traditional journalism had often relied on official statements and government sources, but a new generation of reporters sought to expose hidden truths, hold leaders accountable, and challenge the narratives presented by those in power. The shift in journalism coincided with a period of intensifying political paranoia, particularly within Richard Nixon's administration. Nixon and his inner circle feared leaks, dissent, and opposition, leading them to use increasingly aggressive and illegal tactics to maintain control over the political landscape. The Pentagon Papers leak in 1971, which exposed decades of government deception about the Vietnam War, further fueled Nixon's distrust of the press and deepened his administration's obsession with secrecy. It was in this climate that the Watergate scandal unfolded, one of the most infamous moments in U.S. political history. When 5 men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee, DNC headquarters at the Watergate complex on June 17, 1972, it initially seemed like a minor burglary. However, investigative journalists Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post followed the trail, uncovering a vast network of corruption, political espionage, and illegal surveillance that led directly to Nixon's White House. Their reporting, aided by an anonymous government source known as Deep Throat, later revealed to be FBI official Mark Felt, revealed that the break-in was part of a broader effort by the Nixon administration to sabotage political opponents. The scandal snowballed into congressional hearings, a Supreme Court battle over Nixon's secret tapes, and ultimately the first and only presidential resignation in U.S. history on August 8, 1974. The Watergate scandal not only brought down a president, but also transformed American journalism, proving that the press had the power to expose corruption at the highest levels of government. It set a new standard for investigative reporting, reinforcing the media's role as a watchdog and forever altering the relationship between the government and the press. As the investigation into the Watergate break-in unfolded, it quickly became apparent that this was not a simple case of burglary. The 5 men caught inside the Democratic National Committee (DNC) headquarters were carrying high-tech surveillance equipment, cameras, and wads of cash with sequential serial numbers, indicating a coordinated operation rather than an amateur crime. Law enforcement officials soon discovered that the burglars had ties to President Richard Nixon's re-election campaign, specifically to the Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP. 2 of the men arrested, E. Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, were not ordinary criminals. They were former intelligence operatives with connections to the White House and Nixon's inner circle. Their mission was to wiretap phones, steal confidential documents, and gather information on political opponents, all part of a broader strategy to secure Nixon's re-election by any means necessary. At first, the Nixon administration downplayed the incident, dismissing it as an overblown story. However, investigative journalists, particularly Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, continued to pursue leads that pointed to a much larger conspiracy. Their reporting, guided by an anonymous source known as Deep Throat, later revealed to be FBI official Mark Felt, linked the break-in to a wider pattern of political sabotage, illegal surveillance, and cover-ups orchestrated by the Nixon White House. As more evidence surfaced, it became clear that the Nixon administration had engaged in a massive cover-up, using hush money, manipulated law enforcement agencies, and even the CIA to obstruct the investigation. In a dramatic turn, the existence of Nixon's secret Oval Office recordings was revealed, tapes that would ultimately expose the extent of his involvement in the scandal. By 1973, the Senate Watergate Committee launched hearings, bringing shocking testimony to the public, including revelations that Nixon had approved the cover-up. The crisis deepened when the U.S. Supreme Court ordered Nixon to hand over the tapes, leading to the infamous smoking gun tape, which provided undeniable proof of his role in obstructing justice. Facing imminent impeachment, Nixon chose to resign on August 8, 1974, becoming the first U.S. president to step down from office. His departure marked the dramatic culmination of a scandal that shattered public trust in the government and reshaped American politics for decades to come. The Watergate scandal unraveled. It became clear that the break-in at the Democratic National Committee, DNC headquarters, was not an isolated event, but part of a larger campaign of political espionage and sabotage orchestrated by Nixon's re-election team. The men arrested inside the Watergate complex, James McCord, E. Howard Hunt, G. Gordon Liddy, and others, had direct ties to the committee to re-elect the president, Creep. McCord, a former CIA officer, served as Creep's security coordinator, while Hunt and Liddy had been involved in covert operations designed to undermine Nixon's political opponents. Their objective that night was to fix faulty wiretaps they had previously installed on the phones of key Democratic officials, ensuring that Nixon's campaign could gather intelligence on Democratic strategies ahead of the 1972 election. The break-in, however, was only the tip of the iceberg. As investigators followed the trail of evidence, they uncovered a widespread campaign of political dirty tricks used by Nixon's team to manipulate the election. These included planting false news stories to discredit Democratic candidates, sabotaging rival campaigns by infiltrating their teams and spreading misinformation, engaging in illegal fundraising schemes to funnel money into Nixon's re-election efforts. The cover-up that followed proved even more damning than the crime itself. In the wake of the arrests, Nixon's administration went into full damage control mode, attempting to obstruct the investigation by using hush money, government agencies like the FBI and CIA, and even executive privilege to prevent the truth from coming out. However, thanks to relentless investigative reporting by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, the testimony of insiders like John Dean, and the revelation of Nixon's secret Oval Office recordings, the conspiracy was fully exposed. By August 1974, with the threat of impeachment looming, Nixon had no choice but to resign in disgrace, becoming the first U.S. president to step down from office. The Watergate scandal had far-reaching consequences, leading to sweeping reforms in campaign finance laws, stricter oversight of government surveillance, and a profound loss of public trust in the presidency. It remains a defining moment in American political history, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of investigative journalism in holding leaders accountable. As news of the break-in spread, the White House immediately went into damage control. Nixon's press secretary, Ron Ziegler, dismissed it as a third-rate burglary, insisting that the administration had no involvement. The Nixon White House worked behind the scenes to obstruct the investigation, using government agencies like the FBI, CIA, and even the Justice Department to stall inquiries. The cover-up began almost immediately. Money linked to Nixon's re-election campaign was used to pay the burglars for their silence. White House officials, including Nixon's Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman and Domestic Affairs Advisor John Ehrlichman, worked to conceal any ties between the break-in and the president. They pressured law enforcement agencies to halt investigations, fearing that if the truth came out, it could ruin Nixon's chances for re-election. Despite the administration's attempts to downplay and dismiss the break-in, cracks in the story began to emerge. Investigative journalists, particularly Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, refused to let the story die. Their relentless pursuit of the truth, along with leaks from an anonymous source known as Deep Throat, would eventually unravel a scandal that shook the foundations of American democracy. As the Nixon administration worked tirelessly to cover up its involvement in the Watergate break-in, two young investigative journalists from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, refused to let the story fade. Their relentless reporting would play a crucial role in exposing one of the greatest political scandals in American history. Woodward and Bernstein's investigation into Watergate started with a simple break-in, but it quickly spiraled into one of the greatest political scandals in U.S. history. Their reporting uncovered a vast web of corruption, illegal activity, and obstruction of justice, all linked directly to the highest levels of government. One of their most crucial findings was that the burglars were not ordinary criminals, but had direct ties to Nixon's re-election campaign, CREEP. As they followed the money trail, they discovered that the cash used to fund the operation had been diverted from secret campaign donations, many of which had been obtained illegally through corporate contributions and slush funds. The biggest breakthrough in their investigation came from a mysterious government insider who went by the alias Deep Throat. For months, this source provided Woodward with critical inside information, guiding them toward key connections, cover-ups, and White House involvement. Decades later, Deep Throat was revealed to be Mark Felt, the associate director of the FBI. He had become disillusioned with the White House's interference in the FBI's investigation and decided to leak information to ensure that the truth was exposed. Through a combination of leaked documents, financial records, and insider testimonies, Woodward and Bernstein uncovered a systematic effort by the White House to sabotage political opponents, a large-scale cover-up involving bribery, obstruction of justice, and abuse of power. Nixon's personal involvement in ordering illegal activities and suppressing investigations. The relentless reporting of the Washington Post, combined with congressional hearings and mounting evidence, ultimately led to Nixon's resignation on August 8, 1974, the first and only time a U.S. president has resigned. The Watergate scandal remains a powerful example of the importance of investigative journalism and government accountability, forever altering the relationship between the American people and their leaders. As Woodward and Bernstein continued their investigation, Deep Throat's guidance proved invaluable. His infamous advice, "Follow the money," became the key to unraveling the deep web of corruption behind Watergate. By tracing financial transactions and campaign donations, the journalists discovered a secret slush fund that had been used to finance a wide range of illegal activities, including wiretapping political opponents and journalists, planting false information in the media to discredit Nixon's rivals, breaking into offices to steal confidential documents, using government agencies, such as the FBI, CIA, and IRS, to target political enemies. As these bombshell reports appeared in the Washington Post, public perception of Watergate began to shift. What had initially seemed like a minor break-in at a political office was now being exposed as a vast criminal conspiracy orchestrated by the highest levels of government. Under mounting pressure, Congress launched official hearings into Watergate. Testimonies from former White House aides, leaked White House tapes, and continued media coverage revealed undeniable evidence that Nixon and his administration had not only orchestrated illegal activities, but also attempted to cover them up. With impeachment looming, Nixon made a desperate attempt to maintain his presidency, but the release of the smoking gun tape, a recording proving he had directly ordered the cover-up, sealed his fate. On August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned from office, becoming the first and only U.S. president to do so. The Watergate scandal forever changed American politics, leading to greater scrutiny of presidential power, new laws regulating campaign finance and government ethics, a deepened public mistrust in government that still lingers today. Ultimately, the scandal demonstrated the power of investigative journalism and the importance of holding leaders accountable, ensuring that no one, not even the president, is above the law. John Dean's testimony was a turning point in the Watergate investigation. He provided first-hand evidence that Nixon was not just aware of the cover-up, but had actively orchestrated it. Dean described meetings where Nixon and his top aides discussed hush money payments to the burglars, ordered the FBI to halt its investigation, and planned ways to obstruct justice. His detailed accounts painted a damning picture of a president abusing his power to protect himself. However, the most shocking evidence came just weeks later. Alexander Butterfield, a former White House aide, revealed the existence of a secret taping system in the Oval Office, a system that had recorded Nixon's conversations, including those related to Watergate. The tapes became the ultimate proof of Nixon's involvement. When investigators demanded access to the recordings, Nixon refused, citing executive privilege. This led to a legal battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court. In United States v. Nixon, 1974, the court ruled that Nixon must hand over the tapes. One tape, recorded on June 23, 1972, became known as the smoking gun tape. It revealed Nixon ordering his aides to use the CIA to obstruct the FBI's investigation, clear evidence of obstruction of justice. With this revelation, Nixon's support collapsed overnight. Facing certain impeachment, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974. The next day, Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as president, declaring that our long national nightmare is over. A month later, Ford granted Nixon a full pardon, a controversial decision that angered many Americans, but, according to Ford, was necessary to help the country move forward. The Watergate scandal left a lasting impact on American politics, leading to new laws on campaign finance, government transparency, and limits on executive power. Most importantly, it cemented the role of the press as a watchdog against government corruption, proving that even the most powerful leader in the world could be held accountable for his actions. As the Watergate investigation intensified, one revelation would change everything: the existence of the White House tapes. These secret recordings, made at President Nixon's orders, captured private conversations in the Oval Office. Nixon had installed this system in 1971, believing it would serve as an invaluable record of his presidency. But in the wake of Watergate, the tapes would become the ultimate smoking gun, offering undeniable proof of his involvement in the cover-up. The fight over the tapes became a constitutional crisis. Nixon initially refused to release them, citing executive privilege, arguing that a president had the right to keep internal White House discussions private. However, prosecutors and Congress demanded access, suspecting that the recordings contained crucial evidence linking Nixon to Watergate. The legal battle escalated to the Supreme Court, culminating in the case United States v. Nixon, 1974. In a unanimous 8-0 decision, the court ruled that Nixon must hand over the tapes, stating that no president is above the law. This landmark ruling reinforced the principle of checks and balances, proving that even the highest office in the land was subject to judicial oversight. When the tapes were finally released, their contents were damning. One tape, recorded on June 23, 1972, just days after the Watergate break-in, captured Nixon ordering the CIA to interfere with the FBI's investigation. He instructed his aides to pressure intelligence agencies to shut down the probe, fearing it would expose deeper connections between his administration and the break-in. This tape, now famously known as the smoking gun tape, provided irrefutable proof that Nixon had engaged in obstruction of justice. On the evening of August 8, 1974, President Richard Nixon addressed the nation from the Oval Office. In a solemn and historic speech, he announced his resignation, stating that he no longer had enough support to continue leading the country. The following day, on August 9th, he boarded Marine One on the White House lawn, giving a final wave before departing for his home in California. He became the first and only U.S. president to resign from office. With Nixon's departure, Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. In his first address to the nation, Ford reassured the American people, famously stating, "Our long national nightmare is over." He promised to restore trust in government and move the country past the scandal that had deeply shaken the nation. However, just a month later, Ford made a controversial decision that divided the country. He granted Nixon a full pardon for any crimes he might have committed during his presidency. Ford argued that the pardon was necessary to help the nation heal and avoid a prolonged legal battle. But for many Americans, it felt like a betrayal, proof that the powerful could escape justice while ordinary citizens faced consequences for their actions. His approval ratings plummeted, and some believe this decision cost him the 1976 election. The Watergate scandal left an enduring impact on American politics. It led to major reforms aimed at preventing similar abuses of power, including the Ethics in Government Act, 1978, which increased transparency and restricted government officials' financial dealings, stronger campaign finance laws, limiting how money could be raised and used in elections. Most importantly, Watergate changed the relationship between the American people and their government. It deepened public skepticism, making citizens more critical of their leaders and the institutions meant to hold them accountable. The scandal also reinforced the role of investigative journalism as a crucial check on power, demonstrating that determined reporters armed with facts and persistence could expose corruption at the highest levels. Even today, Watergate remains shorthand for political scandal, and the lessons from this dark chapter continue to influence American democracy. Realizing the inevitability of his fate, Nixon made the unprecedented decision to resign, avoiding what would have been a humiliating and almost certain impeachment. On August 8, 1974, he addressed the nation in a televised speech, solemnly declaring, "I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first." The next morning, on August 9, 1974, Nixon submitted his resignation letter to Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and left the White House for the last time as president. As he boarded Marine One, he famously gave a double victory salute, a final gesture that many saw as defiant, while others saw it as a moment of profound irony. With Nixon's departure, Vice President Gerald Ford was sworn in as the 38th President of the United States. Ford sought to move the country beyond the scandal, declaring in his inaugural address, "My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over." However, Ford's decision to pardon Nixon just a month later, on September 8, 1974, sparked national outrage. He justified the pardon as a way to heal the country and prevent a prolonged legal battle that would further divide the nation. Yet, many saw it as a political deal, reinforcing the belief that powerful figures could escape justice. Ford's approval ratings plummeted, and the controversy contributed to his loss in the 1976 presidential election to Jimmy Carter. The legacy of Watergate went far beyond Nixon's resignation. The scandal led to major governmental reforms, including stronger transparency laws, such as the Ethics in Government Act, 1978, which increased financial disclosure requirements for government officials. Campaign finance reforms, aiming to limit secret contributions and illegal funding. Greater congressional oversight of intelligence agencies, reducing the ability of presidents to misuse them for political purposes. Most importantly, Watergate permanently altered the public's trust in government. Americans became more skeptical of their leaders, leading to increased demands for transparency and accountability. Investigative journalism, which had played a crucial role in uncovering the scandal, gained newfound respect, reinforcing the press's role as a check on power. Even today, the term Watergate is synonymous with political scandal, and its lessons continue to shape how the nation views corruption, power, and the importance of holding leaders accountable. Nixon's resignation may have closed one chapter, but the political and legal battles of Watergate continued to reverberate across the nation. Just a month later, on September 8, 1974, President Gerald Ford granted Nixon a full and unconditional pardon, arguing that it was necessary to heal the country and move forward. Ford's decision was met with intense backlash, with many Americans believing that Nixon had escaped justice. The pardon significantly damaged Ford's credibility, likely contributing to his loss in the 1976 presidential election to Jimmy Carter. Beyond Nixon's personal fate, Watergate had lasting consequences on American politics and government. The scandal exposed deep flaws in the political system and led to major reforms aimed at preventing future abuses of power, including the Ethics in Government Act, 1978, which required greater financial disclosure from public officials. New campaign finance laws to curb secret donations and illegal funding. Increased congressional oversight of intelligence agencies, ensuring they couldn't be misused for political gain. Perhaps the most profound effect of Watergate was the erosion of public trust in government. Before the scandal, Americans generally had faith in their leaders. Afterward, skepticism and cynicism became the norm. Investigative journalism also emerged stronger than ever, with reporters seen as crucial watchdogs holding those in power accountable. Even today, the legacy of Watergate looms large. The suffix "gate" has become shorthand for political scandals, and the lessons of the era continue to shape debates about government transparency, accountability, and presidential power. Watergate remains a defining moment in U.S. history, a reminder that no one, not even the president, is above the law. The pardon of Richard Nixon remains one of the most debated decisions in American political history. At the time, public opinion was overwhelmingly against it. A Gallup poll found that nearly 60% of Americans opposed the pardon, viewing it as an unjust escape from accountability. Many believed that Nixon should have faced trial like any other citizen, particularly given the overwhelming evidence of obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and other criminal activities tied to the Watergate scandal. Yet Ford defended his decision, arguing that a prolonged trial would have paralyzed the nation. Watergate had already consumed the country for over 2 years, and Ford worried that further legal proceedings would prevent the government from addressing urgent issues, such as the struggling economy and lingering effects of the Vietnam War. He believed that prolonged and divisive debate over Nixon's fate would weaken America at a critical moment. Over time, some historians and legal scholars have come to see the pardon as a pragmatic, if politically costly, move. Ford himself admitted that he knew it would damage his presidency, but he believed it was necessary for the country's recovery. In 2001, the John F. Kennedy Library awarded Ford the Profile in Courage Award, recognizing his courageous decision to place national interest above his own political future. Ultimately, the Nixon pardon set a powerful precedent about presidential accountability. It reinforced the idea that presidents are not immune to scandal, but it also raised questions about whether high-ranking officials can avoid justice through political maneuvering. Even today, the debate continues. Was it a necessary act of healing, or a dangerous precedent that placed the presidency above the law? Watergate's impact on American politics was profound and far-reaching. It led to sweeping reforms aimed at preventing future abuses of power, including new laws on campaign finance, government transparency, and congressional oversight. The scandal prompted Congress to pass the Ethics in Government Act, 1978, which established financial disclosure requirements for federal officials and created special prosecutors to investigate executive misconduct. Additionally, the Foreign to Us Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, of 1978, imposed stricter regulations on government surveillance, aiming to prevent the kind of unchecked power that had flourished under Nixon. The scandal also redefined the role of investigative journalism. The work of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein at The Washington Post proved how relentless reporting could expose corruption at the highest levels. This inspired a new generation of journalists and reinforced the importance of a free press as a check on government power. News organizations became more aggressive in their pursuit of political scandals, a trend that continues today. Perhaps the most lasting effect of Watergate was its long-term damage to public trust in government. In the early 1960s, more than 75% of Americans said they trusted the government to do what was right most of the time. By the late 1970s, that number had plummeted to below 40%, and it has never fully recovered. The scandal instilled a sense of cynicism and skepticism about politicians, reinforcing the belief that those in power are often willing to bend or break the law for personal gain. Even today, the term Watergate has become synonymous with political scandal, and lessons continue to shape American politics. From the Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s to the Clinton impeachment and even modern political controversies, the specter of Watergate looms large, serving as a reminder of the need for accountability, transparency, and an independent press in a functioning democracy. One of the biggest consequences of Watergate was the rise of investigative journalism. The relentless reporting by Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of The Washington Post proved that the press could hold even the most powerful figures accountable. This inspired a new generation of journalists who sought to expose corruption at the highest levels. In the years following Watergate, investigative journalism led to further major political revelations, including the Iran-Contra scandal in the 1980s and the Clinton impeachment in the 1990s. Today, major news outlets continue to pursue political corruption with the same intensity, with scandals like the Russia investigation and the January 6th hearings echoing the Watergate era. These reforms fundamentally reshaped the balance of power between the executive branch and Congress, reinforcing the system of checks and balances. The War Powers Act of 1973 was particularly significant, as it sought to curb the president's ability to engage in military conflicts without congressional consent. This was a direct response not only to Watergate, but also to the Vietnam War, where presidents had escalated U.S. involvement without formal declarations of war. The act required the president to notify Congress within 48 hours of deploying military forces and mandated troop withdrawal after 60 days unless Congress explicitly authorized an extension. The Ethics in Government Act of 1978 further strengthened accountability by introducing financial disclosure requirements for top officials, ensuring greater transparency in government dealings. It also created mechanisms for appointing independent counsel, allowing outside investigators to probe potential misconduct by high-ranking officials without direct presidential interference. This law was pivotal in later investigations, including the Iran-Contra affair and the Clinton impeachment inquiry. Additionally, the Federal Election Campaign Act, FECA, amendments of 1974 imposed strict limits on campaign contributions and required campaigns to disclose their donors. This aimed to prevent the kind of secret, unregulated fundraising that Nixon's Committee to Re-elect the President, CREEP, had engaged in, which had fueled the Watergate scandal. The creation of the Federal Election Commission, FEC, provided oversight to enforce these new rules, though campaign finance remains a contentious issue in American politics to this day. These reforms, while significant, were not a cure-all. Over time, presidents have tested the limits of executive power, and political scandals have continued to emerge. However, the Watergate-era reforms laid the groundwork for modern government accountability, setting a precedent for transparency, ethical conduct, and congressional oversight that remains relevant in today's political landscape. Despite the safeguards put in place after Watergate, the potential for political scandals remains. The Iran-Contra affair of the 1980s, where the Reagan administration secretly sold weapons to Iran and used the proceeds to fund Contra rebels in Nicaragua, despite congressional prohibitions, proved that executive overreach and covert operations could still occur. Similarly, the Clinton impeachment in the 1990s over perjury and obstruction of justice demonstrated how personal misconduct could entangle a presidency. More recently, the impeachments of Donald Trump and the ongoing concerns about misinformation, election interference, and abuse of executive power highlight the continuing relevance of Watergate's lessons. However, one of the most profound impacts of Watergate is the heightened role of investigative journalism and whistleblower protections. The reporting of Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein exposed the Watergate scandal, setting a precedent for aggressive journalism that holds those in power accountable. Today, media outlets, watchdog organizations, and independent journalists are equipped with advanced tools for uncovering corruption, making it harder for major cover-ups to go undetected. Additionally, laws protecting whistleblowers, insiders, who expose government wrongdoing, have expanded, ensuring that those who reveal misconduct are less likely to face retaliation. While the potential for a new Watergate exists, the lessons learned from the scandal have fundamentally altered the way the U.S. government and society respond to political corruption. The heightened scrutiny on presidential power, legal reforms, and the expectation of transparency make it more difficult for such a large-scale abuse of power to go unchecked. That said, history has shown that no system is foolproof, and vigilance remains key. Watergate didn't just bring down a president, it reshaped the very foundation of American democracy, reinforcing the idea that no one, not even the president, is above the law. Watergate was never just about a break-in. It was about the abuse of power at the highest levels of government. It exposed a culture of corruption, secrecy, and deception that shook the foundations of American democracy. Nixon's downfall wasn't just the result of the crime itself, but of the cover-up, the lies, and the blatant disregard for the law. His resignation was a moment of reckoning, proving that not even the president is above accountability. But here's the question. Was Nixon truly worse than other politicians? Or was he just the one who got caught? Some argue that many leaders engage in backroom deals and dirty politics. But Watergate was unique in that it was exposed so publicly and so undeniably. Others believe Nixon's actions set a dangerous precedent, and that his resignation was necessary to protect the integrity of democracy. What do you think? Did Nixon deserve to go down, or was he just playing the same political game as everyone else? Let's discuss in the comments. And if you love diving into the hidden truths of history, subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from the past.